Hi guys, and welcome to a slightly different video this week. Normally I do studio vlogs, but this week I'm going to be designing a character. Now I'm still learning and these methods are just how I use Procreate, but what I've done is add some instructions to the screen so that you can press pause and look at what I'm doing on Procreate instead of rewinding as I'm talking and trying to work it out that way. So feel free to comment below. I'm happy to answer any questions. I try to get back to everyone. So this brush that I'm using, I got it from the Sara Faber Patreon. I think any tier can get this brush and I really love it for sketching. So I use that, and then I think later on I'm using her Grainy brush for the outline. So although I'm doing a full character sketch, what I tend to do is draw the face bigger first. Basically, I find it quite tricky to draw the face when it's really small, and you'll see me selecting the drawing a lot and using the warp tool. I absolutely love this tool. There's also liquify, which I haven't used in this video, but it's something that I'm experimenting with. It just helps you push the shape and exaggerate things because I'm not going for a realistic image. I'm going for a character design, like an illustration, so all the lines can be exaggerated, and that tool really allows me to push the proportions and things like that. So I'm not using a reference photo here. I did have one at the beginning of this video, but that's going to be for the outfit later on. And I'm just testing different lips, noses, eyes, and please bear in mind that I have erased some of the footage of the other lips that I drew and noses, because if I kept it all in, the video would just be so long. That's 5 hours worth of footage that I've had to cut down, so I hope you don't mind. So please excuse my hand there. I was actually taking off an ND filter because it was giving the iPad like a rainbow effect on the screen, so I decided to just take it off. So as you can see, I never go for the first positioning of the eyes or the nose. I always have a play around with the positioning, make it higher, lower. I don't have like a strict routine of where the eyes should go, although they're usually about halfway down the face. And you can see here I flip the canvas because that's a really good way to see if the proportions are right. As soon as you flip the canvas, you'll kind of notice the parts that don't look right. You don't always notice them until you flip it, so I really recommend flipping the canvas. I also tend to draw the hair on a new layer. If I want to try a different style, I can just hide that layer and draw it again. So we're going to move on to anatomy next. Anatomy is something I'm definitely working on. I just wanted to show you here, if you find an image you really like maybe an outfit that you want to use, and it's not in the right position, you can just flip it in your photos. So the method I'm going to show you now, I don't use it all that often, but I think it's a good starting point to see where the joints in the body actually should be. Obviously, they're quite exaggerated, but basically what I'm doing is duplicating the face and creating 7 heads. Basically, the body is meant to be made up of these 7 heads. I'm then using the drawing grid on Procreate just so I can use the lines in between each face. Now, this isn't a strict rule, but it's just something that can help if you're a beginner, and I'm still learning anatomy, so this is just something that I sometimes do if I want a little bit more structure to my piece. As you can see, the knee on the left is like further to the left and closer to the camera, so that will be slightly bigger than the other knee. And the elbows are in the C section, so the third head down, the middle of that is where the elbows would be. And then you've got the wrists towards the bottom of the D section. Sometimes it's nicer just to go with a freer way of drawing the anatomy, based more on gesture than this stricter method, but as I say, I'm still practicing, so it's quite nice to try. You'll notice that I don't draw the hand for ages. I totally ignore that. And now I'm just using the warp tool to add a little bit more movement because her left shoulder is slightly higher than her right shoulder. And now it's time to do a rough sketch for the clothing. Just bear in mind, this is an absolute rough sketch. Like, you don't have to worry about it being perfect at this stage. Usually I would redraw this a good 3 or 4 times, but in this process I think I do it twice, just because it was taking so long and I really wanted to get this video out to you guys. So maybe for the next video I'll do a longer one and show you what I would normally do. I'm also playing around with the size of the head. I'm going to make it a little bit more exaggerated than it would be in real life because it's a character design and it's a bit more cartoon-like than realistic. So next I'm going to lower the opacity of the first sketch and I'm sketching it again. This time I'm cleaning up the sketch, but it's not a complete finished outline. When I do the next stage, that is the line art stage, it doesn't have to follow this sketch exactly. I'm still tweaking things here and, you know, making it just more refined. I decided to simplify the jacket. I just felt like there were too many folds and it was just a bit distracting and busy. So the sleeve is just a simple kind of balloon-like sleeve at the bottom, and it is more exaggerated than it would be in real life, which I quite like. I'm also using a red-brown colour, which just helps me differentiate from the sketch underneath. I am aware that this left leg is a little bit weird, so I do go back and tweak that. So I'm happy with how this sketch is coming along. As I say, I think I would normally redefine the sketch again, and I would advise you do that because in the end, I'm not happy with the shoulder on the right hand side. There's something a bit funky about the jacket. Although in the reference photo it is pulling forward, I still think I could have refined that a little bit more. And here I'm just testing out whether I want to cut off the shoes. I don't normally do full body character designs. I prefer kind of a 3/4 body or a half body or even just the face and shoulders. But for the purposes of this video, I thought I'd just do the whole thing and show you what I would do if I was doing a full body character. So here you can see I'm lowering the feet just because I want to add a little bit of ankle. I think it adds to the character. So for the line art, I lower the opacity of the next sketch layer, add a new layer above, and I'm going to use the Grainy 2B pencil by Sara Faber in black. I really love this pencil. It just adds a really nice grainy texture. I love adding texture to my pieces. I don't like having such a flat brush, and I found that when I was using a pencil for that grainy look, it just wasn't strong enough, and this I absolutely love. It's almost like an inking brush, and I find that the best way to use it is to go over it a few times and add thicker lines in certain areas. So although the Apple pencil has pressure sensitivity, you know, if you push harder it's going to make a thicker line. I really like going back over and making certain lines thicker because I think you have so much more control over where you want the thickness to be. So here you can see I'm adding an extra thickness to the eye and the eyelids. So for the eyebrows, I like to keep them quite simple. I like a block with thinner lines for the actual hairs, and then same with the hair itself. Sometimes I add more lines, others I like to keep it simple. It's just a style preference, and I'm just trying to experiment with every drawing that I do and seeing which one I prefer. If you go to my Instagram and look at my illustrations, you'll see that although I'm trying to have a consistency to my illustrations, there are different ways I draw, and by testing out all these different techniques and not restricting yourself to the same process every time, I think that's how you learn. And like you can see here, I'm adding a slightly thicker line. I think the line art stage is my favourite just because you can really start to picture the character and see her come to life. But yeah, I would just experiment with different styles and not put too much pressure on yourself to find a style, because I definitely did that in the beginning, and I think just by practicing, that's how you get your style. You start to find out what you enjoy doing in an illustration. That's what's going to come across to the viewer. Easier said than done, I know. Okay, I realised that I forgot to draw the hand, so I've gone back to the sketch layer and I'm just sketching it out. It's definitely true that most artists will say hands are the hardest. I don't know why. They should be really simple, but I don't know, they just are. I've really loved recently drawing more square fingertips because I think it gives it that animated look, and I definitely am playing around with this a lot because it's just not working. And if I'd have done more sketch layers, this wouldn't have been such an issue. I would have worked it out in the beginning, and now I'm having to mess around with the line art, which I don't recommend you do, because once you distort the line art, it's going to lose some quality. And I think I actually ended up redrawing this line art bit just because I'd moved it around and warped it, and I didn't want to have the hand pixelated or anything like that. So that's why I think it's important to get the sketch exactly right. So now for the colours, I use the brush pen, which is a default brush on Procreate, and I'm not worrying about drawing inside the lines, I'm just getting down the colours. So I've added a diagram to the screen to show what I'm doing for my colour palette, which is split complementary, 2 colours next to each other and 1 opposite. Then there's so many more, there's triadic, words I can't even pronounce, there's just loads of them. And I think it's a good idea to have a look at these. There's so many more than I showed on screen, and it just gives a guide as to what colours go well together. And it's a bit more thought out if you've actually done a draft of the colours. You do a draft of the sketch, so why not draft the colours? So you're going to see me recoloring sections, and if you want to pause the screen to see how I do this, now is the time to do it, because I go too quickly to actually explain it. Maybe I'll go into more detail in a next video, but basically I'm able to pick one specific colour and tweak it without affecting any of the other colours. So I really wanted to change the colour of the trousers, and I was able to select just that colour without dragging and dropping it, because this way you can move around the colour board to see what colour actually works. So you can see the socks are the kind of teal colour with mustard yellow, and I like to tie in elements of the colour so the socks match the top and the jacket. Here I'm also colour picking the jacket and then using that colour and choosing a lighter tone and a darker tone just for the shadow and the lighting. Then I just select this whole layer and move it to the side, and then I use the colour picker for the actual real colouring. So for the final colouring in stage, I'm using the Bonobo Chalk. I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's another default brush on Procreate. So because I want the texture, I'm not just dragging and dropping into each section. So what you can do is colour it and then use the eraser to get rid of the excess. But I really don't enjoy doing this. I don't know why. So I'm using the select tool instead. And I just wanted to share a little tip with the selection tool. So you make a selection, and then if you go to draw the next part, it just creates a line. But if you tap that little circle at the end of the selection, you can then select another part of the illustration on one illustration, which I never knew. Maybe everyone else knows, but I didn't. So for example, I'm selecting that eye, and if I don't tap that circle, it's just gonna create a new line and it's not gonna work. And you can see the lines where everything isn't selected. And then you can go and just do another one. And then obviously when you colour it in, it doesn't colour outside those lines. So I go ahead and select all the skin areas and colour that in on one layer. I'm not going to show you all of the selection because otherwise this video would last forever. So I will cut all that out and show you how I colour. So with the Bonobo Chalk, I like to colour it in lightly and then go over it again to fill in the white spaces. And I definitely like to leave some of the white showing just so that it adds texture and it's not a totally flat colour. One thing people say they like in my drawings is the texture, so this is how I start to create it. I then decided to add a background colour, just something subtle. I should have done this in the colour sample stage, but I forgot, if I'm honest. So yeah, I normally would do that when I'm testing the colours to see what works. But I quite like this kind of creamy colour, so for the blush, I also add it to the ears and the hands, and I'm just using the Bonobo Chalk again, and it's a slightly redder colour than the skin. For the nose, I then like to add the 6B pencil, which is another standard brush, and I create a new layer above the nose blush and make that a clipping mask. And the reason I do it as a clipping mask is so that I only colour in on the layer below, which means I keep that textured look of the Bonobo Chalk. So it's only going to colour in on the Bonobo Chalk, if that makes sense. If you don't create a clipping mask, you're just going to have a more solid colour on the layer above. So that's what I like to do to keep the texture. I go back to the Bonobo Chalk and just add a little bit more highlight to the nose, just to give it some more definition. And I'm doing the same on the lips. I like to darken it towards the middle of the lips, and any part that's going to be kind of protruding is going to be lighter. I really like adding this line to the eye. I think it just adds so much to the character, and it's such a simple thing to do. But basically I take the eye colour and make it slightly darker, and it just gives a bit more dimension to the eye. I'm then adding some highlights to the hair, which I think for the highlights I'm using the 6B pencil again. For these highlights I then set the layer to add, and you can play around and use other settings. This is just the one that I like, and I lower the opacity right down to about 15 to 20%. But it's something you need to play around with and test out those different settings. I never used to use them, I didn't really understand them or know what they are, so I'm still learning, but it's definitely something you want to experiment with because it adds a new kind of dimension to your illustrations. And I'm going to go into more detail with that in the next section, which is gradient maps and more. So gradient maps is something I'm still learning, but it's really worth experimenting. So what I do is go to settings, copy canvas and paste, and you won't see anything. It will appear in your layers and it will put all those layers together into one flat layer, and that way you can duplicate it and add the gradient to that layer. So I work quite fast here, so you might want to pause the screen, but I've turned off the original layer and set the next one up to neon, and I've set the layer to luminosity, which I have spelt luminosity at about 80%. Excellent typing there, Meg. I then duplicate that neon layer and I change it to darken. So I'm kind of contrasting those two gradient maps. I've got one that's luminous and one that's darker, and I set that opacity to about 20%. But honestly, you just want to experiment because it's different for every illustration. It depends on colours and lots of different things. I then move the original layer that I had turned off to the top and I turn it on and I set it to hard light and set the opacity to about 20%. Again, you need to play around with these settings and different opacities. You'll see I adjust these as well later on, and I feel like it just adds a nice soft effect to the illustration. It makes the colours really pop and it kind of gives it a matte look. I don't know how else to describe it, but it just adds something to the illustration and it stops it looking so flat. You can see here, this is the original. It just adds some depth to the darker colours and some brightness to the lighter colours. I then duplicate the line art stage and then select the original line art, which is the bottom one. I go into Gaussian blur and slide it to around 3%, 4%. It just adds this softness to the line art, and you have to lower the opacity, otherwise it can be a bit too much. You just want it to be really, really subtle. I then go back to that original layer, go into adjustments and play around with the chromatic, which you can slide to about 2 to 3% without it overpowering the image. So you can play around with the fall off and exaggerate it if you want to. I like to keep it really, really subtle. Another thing I've started doing is going to noise and adjusting it to about 4%. I don't think you want any more than that because it will be too grainy. But you can see with effects and without effects, it's very subtle, but it adds a softness to the illustration. It's not as crisp and hard, which I really like. I really love the kind of matte look, the luminosity, and the softness around the line art. Again, it's something you want to play around with, and you can have it really exaggerated. Personally, I like to keep it subtle. I think you shouldn't notice these crazy effects unless that's like a look you're going for. And I always flip the canvas just to see what it looks like both ways, because sometimes it just looks better in another direction. And I add my Fizz and Flourish signature, which I've matched in whatever colour is most prominent in the picture, just to tie it all together. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've been able to pick up on some hints and tips. I'm definitely still learning, and also learning these videos, how best to film them. So don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more video tutorials like this.